Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. We tried to film this twice now and it hasn't worked. So we're gonna try to film a birth story today. I have Ivy on our little monitor. She's already been asleep for a while, so I think we're slightly pushing it, but we'll see. We really wanted to film our birth story. I don't necessarily want to, like when I think about it, it's not something that I'm excited about to talk about. Right. It is something that we wanted to film. I feel like in the birth vlog that we did, or I don't know if I said birth vlog before, I meant birth story, but in the birth vlog that we did, you couldn't really see a ton of what happened, and obviously we couldn't talk about it at that point.
This is more of sharing the nitty-gritty details, the realness behind what was a little bit more of like a cutesy vlog.
Right, so I mentioned it in the vlog a little bit. I had what I would consider a traumatic birth. It was not great. So I will say, if you're someone that hasn't had a baby yet and this type of video might be something that makes you nervous about your birth, I would say don't watch this. There are plenty of like positive birth stories, happy birth stories, and we're grateful that we have Ivy and both of us are completely healthy and totally fine. But I just want to say, as someone that watched like a ton of birth vlogs, this is not what I would recommend watching right before your birth. The only thing I will say is that there are some things that happened to me that if we would have known how to advocate for ourselves in those moments, that would have been helpful. But so I do want to say that ahead of time. And then secondly, I want to say we're going to kind of talk about the birth in 3 sections. So with my birth, there was an induction period. Then there was my normal labor, where I was laboring like you see in normal birth vlogs. And then there was my unplanned C-section and kind of what came from that. And then Ben will also talk to his experience a little bit throughout these different things, which I think is interesting from a guy's perspective as well. I expect this to be a pretty long video, so if there's certain sections that you would prefer to watch versus watching the whole thing, just check out the little timestamps in the description below. But without further ado, because this is a long story, let's jump into the induction. We kind of talked about the induction in the birth vlog, so I won't go into like the whole piece of it, but basically, long story short, my induction was scheduled for the 27th of December, I think. It ended up being pushed back 2 full days because the hospital was just so packed with people, and they push inductions when they have, what's it called, spontaneous labor or regular people coming in who are in labor. They obviously push back inductions. I wanted to just have the baby checked because I was over 41 weeks. The doctor told me to go into the triage part of the labor and delivery at the hospital. We went there and they ended up just keeping us until they had a room open because I was first on the list for inductions. We ended up getting up into a room. I want to say we were there for like 2 hours before I got a room, something like that. Everything was fine. Funny story, Ben realized when we got to triage that he hadn't left the key for the dog sitter out, so he had to leave, which was like, in the moment, worst case scenario because I was so nervous. I ended up just being in the room by myself anyway, so there wasn't anything going on.
Well, and also like super fortunate that our hospital was 15 minutes away.
From there, I had a great nurse in there, and then my next nurse came out, and her name is Kendra, and she was a good nurse, but she had a lot of energy. She was my nurse that day until nighttime, and then she was my nurse the next day. So if I talk about Kendra, that's who it was. So we get pushed back to another room. What is that called? Just like the delivery room? Labor and delivery.
Right, they're actual labor and delivery rooms, because there's like triage, labor and delivery, and then at least at our hospital, I don't know if all hospitals have this, but then they have like a
recovery.
Yeah.
We're kind of hanging out, and then the doctor comes in. She had decided at the time that she was going to do a foley bulb. If you've ever heard of those, I had not, because I hadn't intended on being induced, so it just wasn't something I was thinking about. So when I thought about induction, I thought about pitocin. I didn't know about all of the other things that kind of went before it. She told me she was gonna do a cervical check to see where I was at, if dilated at all, anything like that. Got me up ready for it. This is like one of the harder parts. So she had me lay down, and I was at 0 dilated, 0 effaced, and my cervix was high. So basically at 41 weeks, 2 days, Ivy was like, nope. My body was like, absolutely not. There was not even a slight amount of dilation. They didn't even say like a ½ centimeter. There was nothing. Now in hindsight, I know what that means, but at the time I didn't, and I was just like, oh well, they'll just give me pitocin and it'll like open up. This was all within like a very short amount of time, but basically the doctor still decided to try the Foley bulb. She basically told me that I was probably gonna feel some discomfort, and I, slid to the end of the bed.
She specifically said, you're in for a treat. I don't even think you heard that.
I did, but I thought she was talking about the actual cervical check, because I had never had one, because I just said I didn't want them at the doctor's appointments.
Yeah, no, she was definitely talking about the Foley bulb insertion. Just wanted to throw that in there because her specific commentary throughout this is like,
yeah, this OB was not great. That happened. She tried to do the Foley bulb multiple times. It was the most excruciating pain. I was like writhing in pain. I was like, she just kept, holding my legs down and trying to keep me in place, and my nurse was trying to calm me down, and they were like, you have to keep your hips down or something. Like, I kept pulling my hips up, and because it was extremely painful. I will say this part was the most painful part of my entire birth. So it was extremely painful. I was just trying to focus on keeping my hips down, and I couldn't. And they were getting frustrated, particularly the OB was getting frustrated with me. I could feel her energy of frustration. And what I remember is, what I think happened is she had the speculum thing in, and she also inserted her hand. And at the time I didn't know what was happening. All I know is that the pain got even worse, and I screamed and told her to stop. I don't even know what I said.
You said, please stop now.
Yeah. So she stopped and came out, and I heard her say to the nurse, I manually dilated her to a 2. What that means is she went in there and opened up my cervix with her hands. At the time I was just laying there in like complete shock. Like, my legs were literally shaking. I couldn't get them to stop shaking. I was trying really hard not to cry, which I don't know if you want to talk about what she said in those moments, because I don't remember.
Yeah, during all of this, just sitting, like, there's a couch in the back corner of the room, and so I'm just like sitting over there, and it's such a weird feeling as the dad in this situation. Mom and baby are the focal point, but it's really weird because you're literally just like shoved to the side. It's truly like you're not even there. So I'm over there sitting in the creepy corner, just like watching this happen. I can confirm that the doctor was getting frustrated with her because it wasn't working. They couldn't get it in there, probably because she was 0 centimeters dilated. Please stop. Even just saying that feels like I'm being stabbed in the stomach. It was the worst experience I've ever had. Emotionally, I could probably say, in like, at least in a very acute instant. I stood up from where I was at instinctually, right? Like, it was such a like guttural, like I felt her pain in that moment, and, I didn't, but. So yeah, it really sucked. It still makes me very, very angry. So afterwards, then Jessie, clearly traumatized. So like she said, she's sitting there and shaking and just clearly in shock. And I obviously, as her partner, am attuned to that and could tell that she was in shock. The OB was like, oh, are you okay? Like, she's like, I'm anxious, or I'm scared, or I like kind of feel like I need to cry. She's like, oh, I can get you like pills if you have anxiety.
Medication. I was like...
And Jessie's like, no, I think I just need to like cry. And she was like, oh, well, as long as they're happy tears, because we don't want sad tears in here.
Just completely unaware of the room, of what she had just done, of like a person that you just ripped open. In general, my entire experience with OBs at this practice, which you'll hear about in the C-section as well, was just complete and utter disregard for the fact that I was a human and I was going to be experiencing things, and that they could have just been much more personable, or at least treated me like a human. It felt very much like I was just a mannequin on a table. What we found out later from our doula was that manual dilation is something that she had to get consent for. So the fact that she just did it without asking me if it was okay,
or even telling us what was going on.
She just did it out of frustration because the Foley bulb wasn't going in, which also makes sense. If you know anything about Foley bulbs, they're not going to go in if you're at a 0% dilation. All I know is that they shouldn't have been trying to force a Foley bulb on someone that was 0 dilated, which is why she manually dilated me, but she did not ask for consent. She did not tell me what she was doing. She just did it, and it was incredibly painful. And in that moment, I thought that I was just reacting to the pain because it was the most pain I had ever felt in my whole life. What actually was happening is that my body was also reacting to the fact that I was assaulted, that I was taken advantage of in that moment, and I was scared, and the doctor was irritated, and she just did what was going to help her versus thinking about what she was doing to someone else.
I just want to mention also that this was all, Jesse kind of mentioned it offhandedly earlier, but even this very specific process, all of this was very, very rushed.
Yeah.
There was
this
really
was all
no...
Like, 10 minutes.
Yeah. There's no time or space. Like, there was no, okay, I can see that that really hurt.
Let's take a breath.
Yeah, do you need a couple deep breaths?
Yeah. No, she just...
I actually intervened at one point after the second try, before they were going to try the third time, to Jesse. I was like, hey, babe, do you need a minute? Do you need to take a couple breaths? Because I could tell she did, and they were not giving her that space, and Jesse, you know, obviously was super overwhelmed. Like I said, completely ignored. It doesn't give you a chance to regulate yourself in that moment. So Jesse had no chance, essentially, because her system was just so overloaded and there was no space given by the practitioners. It's so sad, and you'll see this in the C-section portion of this also. These practitioners have to be as disconnected as they are from the human element of this. Like, of all medical things, this thing should be the one area in which you really are being intentional about that. All OBs and anybody doing anything around birth should be trauma informed. Even if you're not fucking trauma informed, you should at least be able to attune to another human being. I understand that medical practitioners need to disconnect some emotionally because, you know, they have to do, you know, they have to cause other humans pain and things like that, and it's it would be too much if everything were emotionally connected. But the fact that in moments like this, there was zero empathy in that moment for what Jesse was going through, and she just covered it up with these like syrupy, disgusting comments. She just had this energy about her. She was happy she was the dominant one in the room, and it was really gross.
Okay, so moving past this part, this was probably one of the most traumatic parts of my birth. Unfortunately, the beginning and the end were the most traumatic for me. It must have been like some 6 or something, I don't remember. I had texted my doula at this point and told her what had happened, so she was prepared for the fact that she was probably gonna have to come in. The doctor had told me she wasn't gonna have to come in till the next day, but my doula already was knowing what was going to start happening, so she wasn't planning on having to come sooner than that.
She was furious, by the way.
Yeah, one thing with doulas, if you don't know, because I've had people ask me this that I've told the story to, and they're like, why wasn't your doula there? doulas really aren't there until you're in active labor. Some doulas might come early, but for ours in particular, and I think it's pretty normal for most of them, they don't come until you're in active labor, because you can be in early labor or be induced for 12 plus hours and nothing's happening. That's why she wasn't there. It wasn't because she wasn't doing her job.
The one thing that we could have done better, and this is not guilting us for like at all, we were overwhelmed and things were immediately moving so quickly. If we had had the presence of mind, we should have contacted our doula about what they were planning to do.
What we didn't know, and what a lot of people don't know, is in that moment you can say, okay, I need some time to think about that. And we didn't know that. Like, well, we knew that for other things, but this just seemed like a normal thing. So anyway, we moved into Cytotec, which is supposed to just soften your cervix and kind of get things started for pitocin, which again, if you're like me and you didn't know, they don't normally just start with pitocin unless you're like already a couple, I think 3 centimeters dilated.
Yes, 3 or 4, depending on the hospital, I believe.
They started with Cytotec, which they put that up there while all that other stuff was happening. Okay, yes. So while or after or before, sometime within the manually dilating me part, she put Cytotec up there as well. Then we ate, we did all of that stuff, texted the doula. I wasn't really feeling much. I would feel like a little bit of cramping here and there. We ate really disgusting hospital food. We got our new nurse. Our night nurse came in around 7 something. Her name was Jessica, and then she was not from this hospital though. So that's something that was also a part of it, because they were so busy, they didn't have enough nurses, and she wasn't from the same hospital. So like every time I needed something, she would have to go ask somebody where it was, or she had questions, or she didn't know. And she was still an amazing nurse. I really liked her, but it was just kind of this constant, you know, she had to, like when I asked if I could have like a ball to sit on, she didn't know where they were. So she had to go and find one, or when I asked for certain things. So the second amount of Cytotec was at 9 or 10? 10, and we had been told that it would be oral, but she was thinking that it was going to have to be back in the cervix again. And at that point,
she at least didn't know. That was the other part of this. There was a major miscommunication.
Yeah, because the doctor wasn't filling out
her orders,
which the other doctor wasn't either. So anyway, kept talking about cervical stuff, and I literally would I could just feel my body. I did not want anybody else down there, which, you know, is great when you need to give birth and you think it's going to come from down there. And like, I was terrified of anybody being down there again. So Ben was really like making sure that it was only going to be oral at that time. I got the oral version of it. You put it in like your cheek. And this is about when things start to get pretty spotty for me. I'll kind of just talk about a few things, and then if Ben wants to add anything, he can. My body went into overdrive, and I started having irregular contractions to the point where they weren't stopping. So I was having very strong, painful contractions, which you aren't really supposed to feel on Cytotec, which is why our nurse was like, what the heck? So they just kept happening, and occasionally I would get like a short break, but I really wasn't getting any type of break whatsoever. I remember the nurse kind of being surprised by that, because that isn't really how you're supposed to react to Cytotec. I don't remember much during that time. I remember kind of walking around with my little like wheelie thing. I remember Ben doing some like pressure on my back. And then I remember that I was having a lot of diarrhea. So I was like going to the bathroom, sitting on the toilet, which was extremely painful to sit on the toilet. But I also like couldn't get up off of it. I don't remember a ton else besides when my water broke. So I remember that I was sitting on the toilet and I felt this like pop and gush of water came out. And I was like, to Ben, I'm like, I think my water just broke. But I was like so out of it that's like the only thing I remember, because I was in so much pain during that whole time, and I wasn't getting any breaks, and my body was also trying to recover from this trauma that had happened to me earlier. And all I remember is that, and then I remember the doctor and the nurse coming in like every 10 minutes, it felt like, asking me if I wanted medication. I kept asking for a shower. Again, the nurse didn't know if I could have a shower, so she wasn't giving it to me. So yeah, that's what I remember up until my doula came. So if you want to say what your experience was, because his was, he knew what was going on, whereas
yeah, mine was lucid at this point. The plan for the night, as laid out by our wonderful OB, we should like get this second dose of Cytotec at 10 o'clock. Jessie should take an Ambien, and we should,
which I did,
and she should sleep, and we should both get as much rest as possible because tomorrow's a big day. And you should really take a lot of rest tonight and take that seriously because tomorrow's a big day and you're gonna need your energy for that. Didn't go that way, as Jessie's describing here. Literally within minutes of that 10 o'clock oral Cytotec dose, she started having these irregular contractions. My experience was obviously just being with her and supporting her, but also being able to visually look at the monitor that she was hooked up to and see the contractions. Obviously I could see her during the contractions and in pain and, you know, breathing and all that stuff, but I could also visually see it there. And as Jessie was saying, she like wasn't getting normal breaks in between.
It wasn't your typical early labor, which our doula later told us was most likely because of the manual dilation with the Cytotec pushed me into something that was not normal for most people to go through.
Watching all this happen and like knowing how trauma works, as soon as something sent it into any type of discomfort and fear, it just like amped right up. And so it's like her body couldn't regulate itself and just went into these just like rolling contractions basically. That was basically happening from like 10 p.m. to midnight. It just increased. They became stronger and they became more frequent. Things ramped up so quickly past midnight to the point where Jessie was just like not having any breaks. For me, I was quickly getting overwhelmed by this because it sucked to see her in the situation where she was, you know, it's like pain and discomfort is one thing, but like I said, you know, we watch all this stuff beforehand and it's like, girl, you can do anything for 20 seconds, you can do anything for 30 seconds, you can do anything for 60 seconds, and then you get rest. And I'm like, yeah, like we're game for that, like we can do that, you're strong, like all that shit. And then being in this was like, this is bullshit, this isn't fucking fair. Her body can't do this. Like, I mean, it can, but like, it's not fair. It's not meant to. And so she's just looking at me like, she's like, babe, I can't, like, I need a break. I can't do this.
This is what I thought happened when you're like 8-9 centimeters or like going into pushing unmedicated. I
was like, okay, I'm gonna need our doula sooner rather than later. Like, so called her basically like right at 1 o'clock and am so grateful I did, because from 1 to 2 was what I would say was the worst hour of all of it, like of the night, from a pain standpoint. It sucked for me also, and I'm not sure that dads really get the space to share that experience. I think here and there, like maybe with your close friends and things like that, they do, but because obviously the woman is going through this like crazy, intense, painful situation, I think that guys, rightfully so in those cases, aren't voicing the fact that it sucked. It was one of the hardest things that I've ever had to experience emotionally, and like specifically between the two of us, and we've been through some shit. Watching her go through that, I mean, it was torture, just straight up torture.
Yeah, my chiropractor said that she would rather give birth than be the partner.
Yeah, but I wrote down like this was pure torture, because it was so hard to watch her go through. And again, I think it's important to mention this is not like a normal early labor experience. No. So if you are watching this, if you push past any disclaimers and are still watching, this was not normal.
At this point, I wanted something because I was exhausted and I had 10 to 2 a.m. what is that?
Yeah, 4 hours.
4 hours of nonstop contractions.
Essentially, the real problem at this point was that the exhaustion was really starting to set in, both mental, emotional, and physical.
And fear that this wasn't even the hard part.
Right.
It was supposed to get worse with
Right.
pitocin.
So a lot going on there. When I talked to our doula on the phone, when I called her to come in, she was like, try to avoid pain meds if you can until I get there, essentially, so that I can help with the situation. And I was like, okay, is there anything I should like definitely like hard no when it comes to pain meds? And she's like, yeah, fentanyl. Like, and so next time the nurse was in, and she was like, yeah, I'll give you some pain meds. And Jesse's over here like, please God, like I need something. I was like, yeah, what would you give her? And she was like, fentanyl. This would not have been the right time to administer that because it would have made things much more difficult down the road. I had stopped talking for the most part at this point because she was just destroying me every time I said something. So I was like, I can't say anything here. The worst part of this hour, like right after her water broke and she was on the toilet, the doula was on her way. It was gonna be like 15, 20 minutes. And she was like, I really need something. Like, I can't do this. And I was like, babe, you have to. And she's like, I can't. She looks at me and she goes, you're not hearing me and she's not hearing me. And I hate that. And that to me was like the most painful thing she could have said to me. Moving past this, doula gets there, Jesse gets in the shower, things change dramatically, both because our doula knows what the hell to do, but also because Jesse was finally able to get in the water that we knew was going to be good for her and we're planning on spending a lot of time in, but hadn't been given the go-ahead until this point.
I remember getting in the shower and then I remember my doula being there. I remember it being very painful, but the water was really helpful, which is not surprising because water and showers have gotten me through basically my entire pregnancy with like my migraines and being sick. I spent a lot of time in showers and I think the water is just soothing physically, but also mentally and emotionally as well. Mm-hmm. Ben knew what to do, but at the same time, our doula was trained in it. So she knew where to push counter pressure. She knew what to say. She knew how to move me. And one of the things with our doula, and the reason that I hired her is because I tend to get stuck in like analysis paralysis, especially if I do not feel well or am sick or something like that, scared. So she basically just started doing stuff. If I wouldn't answer her, she would just do what she thought was best. That was really helpful because she would kind of just move me into different positions. If I wouldn't answer her, she would make the decision. She would push on me. She would whatever. So all of this time, Ben was able to actually like step back and do his own thing, which he can talk about in a minute. But again, though, I don't remember as much of this part either. For some reason, this whole part is when my body kind of shut out everything. And I don't know if it was just pain, exhaustion, trauma from earlier.
Brainwave state.
Yes, but you got a break during that time.
Yeah, and truly, like I said, all this, the timing worked out really well because I was shot at this point. So just like Jessie and her body were physically and obviously mentally, emotionally shot, I was very mentally and emotionally shot. And physically, for me, I don't stay up all night. So.
But my labor actually started to be a little bit more normal at this point. So I was getting a little bit more breaks. My body actually started to push its own labor. So it was no longer being pushed by medication and by trauma and by other things that had happened. I'd like to skip forward to the part where we got the pitocin because that was also a piece of it. It kind of just enhanced that process, but I was still, for the most part, not having irregular contractions. I was getting a little bit more of that break, so I was able to do the stuff that my doula and I had like talked about and trained for, and all of these, you know, like being able to breathe through things, using my combs, doing all of this stuff where I was able to, you know, that like 10 to 2 a.m. I was like, I'm never going to be able to do all of this, to the point where I was like, okay, I can do this. Still planning on getting the epidural, but I can do this. I'm able to breathe. I'm able to like work through some of this stuff. It did get to the point where I decided I wanted the epidural. I remember saying, I can't do this anymore. And that was her cue for, okay. So we got the epidural. She had to leave for that part, but Ben stayed. This was a whole nother process. The anesthesiologist was like this old dude. He was not nice. Ben was holding one side of me. My other nurse is holding another side of me. I'm large. Like I'm a large human when I had this full baby inside of me, and I'm having to lean forward and place all of my weight on them while I'm also going through contractions. And I know that you're not supposed to move, but the problem is he's telling me not to move, but then he's asking my nurse to get him things, and she's holding me up. Like, she's part of the reason that I'm not moving. If you take her from me, then I am going to move.
He was just this like cranky old weird doctor that like if you thought about a 70-year-old anesthesiologist, it would be him. So this is early morning, by the way. And
well, like 7 a.m. probably.
So
I got the pitocin around 6. I did get the epidural though. It did end up working.
Immediate game changer.
Immediate game changer. Like as soon as it kicked in, I was like, holy shit, I can do this forever.
Jesse came back into the room is how I like to say it. Like
I was like joking. It was her again. There was a point later where I could feel contractions a little bit in like my tailbone. So I kept telling my doula that I'm like, I have butthole pain. And she like thought it was
the funniest thing
ever because I just kept telling everybody that my butthole hurt. And then we kept forgetting to push the epidural to like get more medication. So all of a sudden I was like, why can I feel stuff? But anyway, so I felt much more myself. I was dozing in and out of sleep at this point. I was exhausted.
Contractions are still happening.
Yeah,
and still,
but I can't feel them. However, I will say at this time, I remember, and now in hindsight, I remember a couple of times my doula just like watching the monitor and just kind of like watching it. And again, at the time, I don't even know what's going on. I was looking at it. Ivy still, we didn't know it was Ivy, but my baby at the time had a heartbeat, and the contractions were still happening. So we were normal. Like, and they were normal. So we were like, okay, everything's going well. And what time was it? Like 10 a.m.?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Probably 10-ish.
The new, thankfully, not thankfully, OB came in because it was no longer the OB that traumatized me the night before. The new OB came in with my nurse, who was Kendra again. Kendra was back. She came back at 7. I don't fully remember exactly what they said, but I remember them saying that there was some irregularities in Ivy's heart rate. So basically when I was having contractions, her heart rate was going down.
Yeah, she was having D-cells.
What I didn't know, because nobody told me this, was at one point they stopped the pitocin because they wanted to see if her heart rate wouldn't do that if they took the pitocin away. And it didn't. It would stop when they took the pitocin away. So apparently that told them that it was the pitocin that was causing the D-cells. I had also overnight, my nurse had noticed that there was meconium in my my water broke, I had fluid like everywhere. That on top of the D-cells, they were worried about that. And basically they weren't confident or comfortable with continuing pitocin, which meant they had no way to continue the labor. There was a chance at that point that my body would continue labor because I was at, I believe, a 4 or a 5.
I think you're at 5, but
there was a chance, and most likely I would have continued, but then they were worried that if something happened later. So basically the decision was they wanted us to have a C-section. I think I mentioned this in other vlogs, but we specifically were very happy about this hospital because I don't know if it's in the entire United States or just in North Carolina. They're one of the lowest hospitals for giving C-sections because a lot of doctors will just give C-sections because they want to go home, they want to hurry things up. Sometimes they'll push a C-section on someone that doesn't necessarily need one. And that was something we were really afraid of happening to us. We didn't want something to be pushed on us, which is a reason that we had our doula. So when they came in and said that we should do a C-section, we were like, okay, we should do a C-section because they're really not gonna push one unless they really believe it.
We were blindsided by this.
Totally. Like I said, I didn't know anything was going on. I didn't notice the decels. I didn't know they were making changes to my pitocin. Nobody told me that, which is something that they should have said that they were doing.
Yeah.
Our doula did notice it, but she wasn't bringing it up because she didn't want to get us nervous. She knew that the doctors were like paying attention.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, is you could like tell that they were paying attention to something, but we didn't really. I don't know.
I had no idea that they were. So our doula did what doulas do, which is she asked them for 10 minutes. She asked them to leave the room, both the nurse and the OB, so that we could kind of process what was going on and decide from there. The thing that she did for me that was really helpful is she came over and sat on my other side. She took my hand. I think Ben took my other hand. And because I just like started crying, because at this point I was like I felt good at this point. So I was just like surprised, and I was like, how is another thing happening?
And we had talked zero about C-sections because it was just not something we assumed we were gonna have to do.
My doula came over and was like, I've been watching it. She's like, I've noticed the decels every time you've had a contraction, her heart rate has gone down. She's like, in my opinion, I believe what they're recommending is correct. But then which was helpful, she was giving me her opinion, which I trusted more than anybody else in the room. No offense, but even to her, she cared about me, plus she understood.
Right.
Whereas like Ben just cared about me, right? He didn't know why they wanted a C-section. But then she also said that, you know, you've done so much. She's like, you knew, your body knew, because I was the one that wanted to be induced at 41 weeks. Everybody else, well, her and Ben were kind of pushing for me to go a little bit longer, to try to push it to the 42 weeks. And even my chiropractor was too. And I was just like, no, like I don't want to go past 41 weeks. You know, she was like, this was the right decision. This was your intuition. It knew that there was a reason that the baby needed to come out now. So she just kind of helped me understand what was going through, answered our questions, kind of just like relaxed us. And then they came back in and we obviously went through. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure we could have said no to it because it wasn't considered an emergency C-section. But I didn't really feel like there was another option. We weren't given any other options, and that seemed like the best option anyway. So we were told we were going to start getting ready for C-section. We were told that we were going to be like the next one in there. They just had to clean it or something like that. And 2 hours later, we finally went in. So it took a while for them to finish up their previous C-section and clean and do all the things that they had to do. So we went in around noonish, something like that. We had different experiences, obviously. My doula was not allowed to come in with us, which was not great for me. Yeah. Ben wasn't allowed to come in with me in the beginning. So he had to go get like washed up or whatever they had to do. What did you have to do?
They just put me in scrubs and literally like sat me in this little corner.
Yeah, just told them to wait. So what they had to do for me, I'm sure, is just get me prepped for surgery. So they came in. I was terrified. I was alone. My nurse came with me, but at this time I wasn't feeling super confident about my nurse. And she was, running around doing things anyway. So they pushed me to the other bed, which they had me like help them, which was confusing because I was like, I literally have an epidural. I can't feel half my body, but okay. So they got me onto the table. They were doing all this stuff. All I remember is laying there and these like two huge lights were above me. They weren't on, but like the surgical lights that you see in like all the movies, or if you've had surgery, these like huge lights over the top of me. And then they were like getting me prepped down below. And then my anesthesiologist, who I believe was like the angel of my C-section, was not the same anesthesiologist, thankfully, that gave me my epidural. It's
like quite literally the opposite. He was like this young, like handsome, calm.
I don't know what he looked like, but what's also funny is we had met a female anesthesiologist that we thought was going to be there. So then when it wasn't her, I was like, who the heck is this
actually
guy?
Liked her too when she came into the room and talked through some stuff with her. So that would have been fine also. But
yeah, he is above me. All I see is his head with his mask on, and he's talking to me
the floating head.
Yeah. And I told him that I was afraid, and he kind of took that as like, okay, I'm gonna help you. So he was obviously doing his job. He was kind of talking me through everything. He was telling me everything that was going to happen. He was explaining to me how I might feel like I'm not going to be able to breathe, and that's okay. And that did happen to me, and I told him, and he was like, remember I told you this would happen, just like take some breaths. He's like, oh, they just tested you, because they basically like test you to make sure that you can't feel anything. And if you notice or your body flinches, they'll obviously give you more medication. But I was just like chatting with him, so he was asking me questions about like what I do, what my husband does, all this stuff. Ben came in at some point, and
yeah, it was like, I'm gonna say time-wise it was probably like 15-20 minutes.
Yeah, I was in there for a while by myself while they kind of got everything ready. But he sat down, and then basically the anesthesiologist like talked me through what was happening. He was like, okay, they're starting now. And then he asked me what kind of music I liked. And at that time, all of the work we had done prior to birth, which our doula had trained us to do, was to like find a playlist that works for you. So I had really liked and been pulled to acoustic guitar music. So he like searched through his Apple Music and found some acoustic guitar, and then it ended up playing like random rock music at some point, and he was like, what is it?
He felt bad. He's like, I don't know why this is on the list.
Yeah, so anyway, he was just really, really nice, and he was explaining to me what was going on. I believe he told me when she came out.
Yeah, he was like, they've got your baby is out. Yeah,
your baby's good. So what I remember in this moment, because you're kind of laying like this, you have your arms out, and there's this big blue thing in front of you. You can't see anything. What I've seen in movies of C-sections is like they show you the baby, they announce that the baby is there. In a good C-section, they bring the baby over to you so you can touch it and hold it for a little bit of time.
Which was my understanding of what was going to happen, was because this was like part of our birth plan, was like to get golden hour. And
we knew I knew we probably wouldn't get like an hour,
right?
But
right at this point,
I was anticipating that to see the baby. So
because they had said that in C-sections they would still bring baby over to dad. None of this happened that day, but like prior to that day, we'd heard that like they would still bring baby over to dad. You can still do skin to skin, so like not to worry about any of that.
Yeah, so again, we weren't prepared for a C-section. My doula wasn't in there, so we were just basing it off of assumptions of how C-sections could be. Obviously, if a C-section is an emergency C-section where your baby is not breathing, where you aren't doing well, I understand why that might not happen. However, so as you can see, we're prefacing this for a reason, because he told me the baby came out. I heard her cry. I started to cry, and then that was it. I remember hearing her cry again, and I could tell that she was further away. Like, they didn't bring her to me. They didn't show her to me. They didn't tell us her sex. They didn't tell us that she was okay. As you guys know, we didn't know if she was a boy or a girl. They just took her away.
Zero communication from
the OB.
What was behind the shield to us, which is like,
the anesthesiologist was trying his best to like tell us what was going on, but that's also not his job. No. They weren't saying anything to us. They were having conversations of their own, talking about where they were going to go for lunch.
Like, it was so awkward to, like, you're only separated by this little like plastic curtain. It's not like you're in different rooms, but there was zero communication as opposed to telling us what's going on, or
where the
baby is, what the baby is.
Is she okay? Is like, what is going on? Like, there was absolutely no, like, it was like I wasn't there.
Right.
Like, they couldn't see my face, so they weren't talking to me. They weren't telling me anything. And I could just faintly occasionally hear the baby cry. To be honest, at that point, I thought that she was a boy because I thought somebody said him. I will say the one good thing that I remember about the C-section is when they took her out, I did hear the OB say this baby's feisty, or the baby, something about it being this is a feisty one or something like that. And I remember being like, I love that. I love
so proud
that my baby is feisty. And I was like holding on to that because that was the only thing that they said to me. They didn't even say it to me, they just said it. Didn't know anything. Eventually a nurse or someone came over and asked if Ben wanted to go see the baby.
And it was probably a solid 15 minutes.
Right. Yeah, because they had already been like sewing me up for a while.
Yeah.
Thankfully, the anesthesiologist stayed with me and kind of talked me through things. I think it was at that moment that he realized that I didn't know the sex of the baby. Yeah, and so he was like trying to figure things. I think he even like asked someone at some point. I don't know.
So they like took me where the baby was. It was not far. They had her like swaddled up and laying there, and cleaned her off or whatever. I forgot exactly what they said, but it was like, so Dad, what do you think? And I was like, what is it? And they're like, wait, you don't know? And I was like, no, nobody said anything. And they're like, oh, it's the baby girl. And then they gave her to me, which I did not feel super safe or confident about, because at this point, so tired. We kind of glazed over the details going into the C-section. I was super anxious about it.
Yeah.
I knew she was gonna be anxious about it, but I was also very anxious, but I was trying to hold that in because I wanted to be the support for her, obviously. So my system at this point was also just like so shot. You have this experience of like knowing that the baby's out. I was so out of it and so drained at this point and running on adrenaline because now we had a baby. So the fact that they gave her to me to like bring over there, I was like, I don't even know if I can walk over without like falling over. So brought her behind the curtain to the floating head. That was Jesse.
I saw Ben and a girl, a nurse that was like behind him. They both stuck their heads over by me, and he had a baby. And in this moment, my brain knew that she was a girl in that moment because she was wearing a pink hat. So like it clicked in that moment, but at the same time that clicked, Ben said, it's our baby girl, or it's our daughter, or something like that. And I started to cry, and then you brought her over by me, I think, and so I was able to like touch her. They put her by my face, so I remember touching her. And then I remember somebody being like, what's her name? And I was like, I said Ivy Elizabeth, but it was just like, in that moment, I was just like so thrown off that I was like, I don't want to tell you the name.
Can we have a second?
But then as quickly as she was there, they took her back away. I think you went with, though.
Not initially, no.
Oh, they just took her?
Yeah.
But you weren't there when they switched me to the bed.
Yes.
Oh, you were? Oh, I don't remember. It was like that floating bed. Yeah, they put me in this like thing that air pilots you over to the other bed. I thought that was cool. After that, we went to like the room, the recovery room. It was like a triage recovery room.
Yeah.
We didn't get to our actual recovery room for like over an hour. And there was a lot within that period as well. Like I still couldn't hold Ivy, and every time they would give her to me, they just kept trying to force me to breastfeed her. So I still didn't really get that time with her until we were like truly in the recovery room.
Jesse passed some massive clot, so they were like worried about that. She was tachycardic during this time, so
they almost like blew, my nurse Kendra almost blew my vein. It like bubbled up, like, I mean truly like this much off my arm.
At this point, it was like, are you fucking kidding me, dude? Like, we just made it through all of this. Can we just like chill now? In the moment or right afterwards, you didn't really realize, but you actually were having a conversation with my mom, which I think was the thing that kind of brought it to light. So I just wanted you to share.
Two things. One, I'm extremely like, anytime I see those like lights or anything that reminds me of those lights that I saw in the C-section room, it just kind of brings a lot of emotion up for me. It's a trigger. When I was talking to his mom, and I've kind of processed this since the birth, I was treated like I wasn't a human. Most people get to feel or see themselves birth their baby, and I had none of that. So I didn't see her come out. I heard her slightly, but nobody showed her to me. Nobody gave her to me. I didn't feel her come out. So it was very confusing for me afterwards, because I was like, I'm no longer pregnant. I have this baby, but I wasn't a part of the part where she came into the world, which sucks. That was taken away from me. It was taken away from Ivy. It was taken away from Ben. I understand that part of that is unfortunate with what happens with the C-section, but I do think that things could have been handled much better, where they could have at least shown her to me. She was not in any harm, and neither was I. So there was no reason that they needed to take her immediately. They could have shown her to me at the least. They definitely could have like had her touch me as well, but the least they could have done was shown her to me, and at least like, so I knew what my child was. Imagine laying there and you hear your baby come out, you don't know what it is, and they just take it. I could faintly
with no
hear,
communication.
With no communication. A lot of people that have this happen to them, it's because their baby needs to go to the NICU, their baby isn't breathing, something is going on, but they usually know what is happening, whereas I didn't know any of that, and she wasn't having any of those issues either. So it was just clear, terrible care, truly. Like, it just was completely not caring about me as a mother. I was just someone that they were cutting open and sewing back up. They weren't thinking about the fact that this is a moment in my life that I will never get back, that they took from me, that I will never be able to recreate, that this will always be the story, and that was taken from me. I have been trying to work through that as best as I can, and a lot of times I feel anger, but I don't really know how to end the statement, but that's what happened, and it was devastating, and it's definitely been very traumatizing for me, and I feel like it's kind of enhanced some anxiety about things with Ivy in general. We're working through those things for sure. So that's the story of our birth. Started off very traumatic, was pretty traumatic in the middle, and ended very traumatic. And I'm laughing just because I truly can't believe that happened. I can't believe that practitioners are allowed to treat patients that way. I can't believe that doulas aren't allowed in the C-section area. All these things, looking back on it now, if I ever decide to give birth again, which in this current amount of time, I can't imagine ever going through anything like this again. But if I ever did, now I have a little bit of knowledge about, in that moment, could I have like screamed at the OB to show me the baby? Probably, but we didn't know that we could do that. And would they have even done it? I don't know. So it just was complete lack of care and of treating the mother in particular like a human, and the father.
I just want to say too, for me, it just makes me really sad that this has to be the experience of mothers and fathers and children. These things are impactful. They have lifelong ramifications in some circumstances.
Right, this OB doesn't even remember my name.
Right. So the fact that that's something that
life
happens regularly and on a daily, hourly, minute-to-minute basis is really, really sad. Mostly for me, where that comes from is the fact that we are very informed, aware people. As individuals, we chose to have a doula, so we had somebody to advocate for us. To have this experience with all of that, it's crazy and just so sad for me to think about people who don't have that, who aren't fortunate or privileged enough to have a doula, or to have life experiences, be trauma informed, or to be even as like self-aware or whatever, and they live with this and experience it and don't even, probably in most cases, know that it happened, and certainly cannot validate that for themselves. It's sad. It really, really is. We need to do better as a medical system and infrastructure and all that.
There's plenty of things that we could continue to talk about, or things that we're working through or still need to work through. So if there's anything, if you stayed till the end somehow, first of all, you're a saint. Second of all,
congratulations.
Yeah, definitely let us know down below, and we'd be happy to share our experience a little bit more and how it continues to impact us, and things that we're gonna do, at least things that I'm planning to do to try to move through that and make sure that Ivy feels loved, that I feel like I got the birth that I wanted, or at least can now have the experience that I want.
So yeah, to just finish on a little bit more of a positive note, I just also want to say that, at least for me, and I think for both of us, we've kind of just made some level of peace with this as much as we can, at least to this point, in that this was how Ivy wanted to come into the world. This is what her birth story was meant to be. This is what Jesse's experience was meant to be. Mine was meant to be. For whatever reason, even if it doesn't make sense, it is what it was, and it was very beautiful. We have a beautiful daughter. They are, both Jesse and Ivy are very healthy. We are taking the time and energy to validate and honor what we went through, but we're also not staying in that place. We are, as Jesse mentioned, empowering ourselves to move through that and to give Ivy the absolute most love that she can experience. It happened and it can't be changed, but we can also still write our own story from here on out.
So thank you for watching this video.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, and we'll see you in the next one from here. I don't really know how to end it, so.